Well, good evening. Hello. Thanks for being here. We're here with Vivid Visions, Memories of Bird tonight. We've got Chuck Haddix and Steve Kraske on the stage. They belong here. So just wanted to mention a few other events that are coming up here in the next few days. We've got tomorrow night here at the Hub, we've got Charlie Parker Salute with Stan Kessler and Friends, in case you're interested. Kansas City area youth jazz on Saturday at 2 p.m. Open jazz jam session on Sunday from 2 to 5. And then our next two events that are really focused for the Charlie Parker month as birthday month are the Kansas City Jazz Orchestra open rehearsal on Thursday at 7 p.m. next Thursday. And then the capstone event is on the 29th of August at the Folly Theater with the Kansas City Jazz Orchestra. So I just wanted to make sure everybody knew about those events, and please feel free to participate, attend. I'd love to have you there. So without further ado, I'm going to pass things off to Steve Kraske and Chuck Haddix. And Chuck always has such wonderful things to share about jazz and history.
Thank you, Steve.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And can we just give it up for Chuck? You know, there really isn't anybody in Kansas City who can talk as authoritatively about Charlie Parker than Chuck Haddix, who has the book out about Bird. He's got the album out about Bird, and he's been talking about Bird and giving tours around the district for years. So let's give Chuck a big round of applause, as he deserves it. Yeah. Let's start and talk about Bird and his legacy. Is it as bright and vibrant today, Chuck, as it was maybe, back shortly after he passed in the 50s? How would you describe his legacy and his image today?
Well, at the Mutual Musicians Foundation, they always say that the tradition jams on. Well, and when the Bird, the tradition still jams on too. And I think he's even more relevant today because of he's influenced so many younger people. He's become part of the jazz education network now. People study his music and take him much more seriously him and his music than they did when he was alive. And I think that anyone that picks up their horn here in Kansas City has got Bird stamped on them. He just continues. You go down to the Mutual Musicians Foundation, you hear Bird. You go to Ted's Tap Room, you hear Bird. You hear Bird all over town, and it's a wonderful thing that we're continuing his legacy here in Kansas City and celebrating him all month long, because that wasn't always the case, here in KC.
You describe him as having as much influence, and tell me if I'm wrong here, as Mozart.
Yeah, there's music before Mozart, and there's music before Charlie Parker and music after Charlie Parker. He changed everything. He changed the way people improvise, how they composed, and his musical language has just become part of the vernacular now, and it lives on.
There's this myth out there, and you've talked about this, that he was not as respected in Kansas City back in the day when he was around. He didn't want to come back here. He described Kansas City, Chuck, as a little bit southern. How did Bird feel about his hometown? Hometowns, KCK and KC.
Well, Bird, had, I think, like any African American during the days of segregation, had mixed emotions about his hometown. But he often returned to. He was, for one thing, he was a big star in Kansas City. This is where he got his start. He lived and worked in Kansas City for 20 years, and he died when he was 34. And he was a big star with the Jay McShann Band. He was referred to as Saxophone Supreme. He was a big star with the Harlan Leonard Band also, and with Lawrence Key's band too. He started as a professional musician by the time he was 15. And everybody knew Bird in town. All the musicians knew Bird. And in a lot of ways, he was kind of he post-racial, I think you'd have to say, because a lot of times he'd jam with the white guys like Charlie White and these other musicians. And that was frowned on by Local 627 and Local 34. There's articles in Downbeat about interracial jam sessions and what a scandal it was. Well, Bird didn't see things that way. And he always had worked with a mixed-race band, too. Usually he had a mixed-race band. I mean, he lifted up Red Rodney, and so many others. And so, yeah, but, there's that whole myth about how Bird didn't like it here, he wasn't a big star. But he was very well known. It's what was amazing when I was doing the research for the book. I started hanging out down at the foundation in about 1972 in Milton's Tap Room. And I would talk to Ahmed Al-Adin and Lukman Hamza and Ernie Williams and Step Buddy Anderson and Piggy Minor and, of course, Jay McShann and people that knew Bird. And everybody had a story about Bird. Some amazing stories. Ahmed Al-Adin talks about how he's standing out, Bird's standing out in front of a club on 12th and Vine. And he's standing out there waiting for a guy that owes him some money and then had something for him. And Bird's aunt walks up and he goes, well, come on in. She goes, no, I'm a church lady. I can't go in there. And, Lukman Hamza talks about seeing Bird walking through the neighborhood with his horn in a sack under his arm in a brown paper bag. And Buddy Anderson showed me on Bird's birthday. I was with Rich Hill and Buddy Anderson, where he introduced Gillespie to Charlie Parker in front of just right up the street from Gates Barbecue on 19th Street and Vine. So, there's all these incredible stories about Bird. And whenever he would travel, when he was on the road, he would always stop off in Kansas City, usually because he needed to hustle up some money. He'd spend all his money on the road, and he'd have to hustle up some money. But he would always stop by and stay with Addie, his mother. And he was a mama's boy. She doted over him. He had the finest clothes when he was younger. And he would he would go to Tootie's Mayfair and jam and hang out with friends and have a good time. And he was a very sociable individual. That LP CD set I produced for Verve, it's an incredible story. It's recordings here in Kansas City, and he was good friends with this guy named Phil Baxter. And Phil was a barber by trade, and by all reports, the biggest pot dealer in the Midwest. And he lived over on Hardesty, and he would have these parties where the races would mingle, and Bird would go over there. And, so Bird maintained his ties to Kansas City throughout his whole life.
And Baxter was the one who had the recordings that you latched onto for the album, right? That came out a couple years ago.
Yeah. There's long been a rumor of a recording that was done of Bird, an open reel tape, and I'd heard about it for years. And when we started up the sound archives, I was contacted by this guy named Barry Baxter. And Barry was this hipster. He always wore house shoes. I think he was in his father's business. He was a true visionary. They were both visionaries, Dispensaries had not arrived in Kansas City yet. And he would come by and we'd talk and we'd have lunch. And he had this tape of Bird, and he would never let me hear it. I didn't hear it. And Barry passed, and his wife gave the tape, 2 open reel tapes and a wire recording of Bird to the sound archive. And the open reel tapes were copies of the wire recording. Wire recordings was a technology, pre-open reel technology, where it's a fishing line thin wire on a metal spool, and it would hold an hour's worth of information. Now, and it's Bird at the top of his game soloing with a bass player. Now, what made it so significant is most of the recordings, the field recordings of Bird, and there's hundreds of them out there, were done by amateur, recordists, and they were recorded to lacquers, which is, or 10-inch discs that would only hold 3 minutes of information. So Bird, he would have to wrap up, only had 3 minutes to do his thing. Where this wire recording, he stretches out for like 52 minutes. And it's just Bird at the top of his game. And Norman Sachs, who's the most foremost collector of Charlie Parker memorabilia, he has 23 autographs of Charlie Parker. We have part of his collection at the university. Contacted Verve Records and told him about this. And Verve had put out a recording called Bird in L.A., and they were field recordings, and they were taken from Norman's collection. And so they decided they want to put out this Kansas City record, and so they asked me to co-produce it. And we had received in the John Tomino collection a disc of Margie and I'm Getting Sentimental Over You, and Norm had the so-called Charlie White recordings, which were Everett G. Ware and little Phil Phillips, who's a guitarist. And so he contributed those to the session, and so we put together this package, this LP and CD of Bird in Kansas City. But it almost didn't happen because Barry's wife decided she didn't want it to have it published. And since it was university property, I had to go through the university. And university lawyers had to approve it. And they finally did just as we were going into production. And so it came out. But I wanted to include another session from 1951 of Bird in Kansas City, recorded at the same time as The Wire, with Woody Herman. But the Smithsonian could not get it together to get me a copy of it. There's one more I wanted to include. It's called Honey Body, and it's in the family of a local family, and it was something that Bird recorded at Wonderland Arcade about 1938. It's Honeysuckle Rose and Body and Soul. But unfortunately, I could not get through to the family. And
So your point is, going back to his feelings about Kansas City, Chuck, by the end of his life, by his 30s, he was okay with Kansas City as far as you know?
yeah, he was.
Because the family, I've had the family on the show before, and they would come up to the grave site, and they would do commemorate his birthday and all of that. So the family was invested in some of this, and they seemed to be okay with where things were.
Yeah, okay. When you think, Kansas City, the heyday of Kansas City jazz lasts from 1923 to 1941, when World War II breaks out. And Bird, like other musicians, traditionally, the musicians from Kansas City wanted to make it in New York City, and Bird was not that different. So when he arrived in New York City, he really felt like he was at home. That was his home. And he lived in New York City the rest of his life, except for a short, disastrous jaunt to California with Gillespie.
Right.
But he always stopped in Kansas City when he was on the road. He toured a lot, too. He played here in 1943 with Billy Eckstein. And he would show up at Local 627 and visit with old friends and just hang out. And there was this place, one of the reasons he would come back here is he can make money. And there's a place out at 79th, originally 79th in Warnell called Tootie's Mayfair. And Tootie was run by Tootie Clarkin, who was a former detective in Kansas City in the 1920s. You imagine what that was like. 3 shows nightly, national acts, local acts. And Bird could always get a gig at Tootie's. And it's kind of funny because as the city limits moved south, so did Tootie. Finally, he ended up on 40 Highway, just right outside, the other side of the street of the city limits. But yeah. Bird, a lot's been made about that, but I don't think that Bird really hated Kansas City. I think he was tied to it for one thing.
Yeah.
Where he's rooted musically, but he always came back here too.
He made his name here, but earlier in his life, there's the famous incident with Joe Jones throwing the cymbal. It was a little rough for him, at least at one point, right? Early on.
Yeah. He was. Bird liked to roost in the balcony above the bandstand at the Reno Club. And the Reno Club was really in the shadow of City Hall, of the police department.
Police department, yeah.
It's Wilson Cherry. And so Bird liked to hang out
there.
For
years I covered cops, and when I first came to town, I parked my car at 12th and Cherry only to find out years later that's where that club was.
Oh yeah,
you know?
yeah. The Reno Club was a very,
Yeah.
very infamous club. It was the biggest little club in the world, and had a hand lender sign, and they did live broadcasts. But Bird used to like to roost in the balcony above the bandstand, where the marijuana smoke was heavy from the Basie band blowing downstairs. And they had a jam session, and Bird sat in, and he faltered, and he was just getting started. He was like 15, 16 years old. And he's faltered while soloing, and Joe Jones threw a cymbal at his feet to show his displeasure. And he got basically gonged and laughed off the stage. And he retreated to his mother's home, and he practiced for 12 to 15 hours a day.
Yeah.
Now there's three woodshed three incidents in Bird's life that shaped him as a musician. It was being humiliated, and then, of course, he's wrecked on his way to play a gig at Musser's Ozark Tavern in summer of 1936, where he broke his back, broke his ribs, and he got a new horn out of it because it destroyed his Selmer. And then the other is when he had his musical breakthrough in New York City, where he was playing Cherokee, and he was able to articulate what he'd been hearing in Kansas City for the first time. But the result of him being humiliated on stage was that he became a great mentor to young musicians. When you talk to Frank Morgan or Hampton Hawes or any of the local cats here, Bird was always ready to lend them encouragement and show them the way. And and I've heard it from so many different musicians about how it's like it is today. Charlie, Ahmed Al-Din learned from Charlie Parker. Now everybody else learned from Ahmed Al-Din.
Yeah, right.
And, that tradition still continues, And so the tradition's passed on from one generation to another. But Bird was really very supportive of young musicians, and he encouraged their aspirations to be a musician.
Help me with something, because we've talked about this. I've never still quite understood it. 35, 36, 37, one of those summers, he goes down to the Ozarks to play for the summer. And everything I've read is that's the summer where he sort of transformed himself from a good player to something supersonic.
Yeah.
What happened down there?
Well, there was a resort called Musser's Ozark Tavern. It was 5 miles south of Eldon, Missouri. And it was owned by...
It's not still there.
Pardon me?
Is it still there?
I don't know.
Yeah.
But it was operated by a guy named Clarence Musser, who was quite a character. He was like a cigar-chomping fire plug. And he was from Kansas City. But he liked to flout racial conventions, and so he had this resort. But he would bring in African-American bands. And because it's Little Dixie, down there, really known as Little Dixie, that area really is, the musicians had to stay on site. And it was a nice place. They had swimming pools, they had tennis, fishing, dance, had a fabulous dance hall there. And so Bird went there with George E. Lee the summer after his wreck, in the summer of 1936. And he went to the woodshed. There was nothing for him to do except for practice. And that's what he did. And according to Gene Ramey, when he returned to Kansas City, he was physically he was musically a changed man. That's where he really came of age, when he was down there.
And that's such an important moment for him and for all of music then, right? I mean,
oh, yeah. And it's just, and it's kind of funny because, George E. Lee, he's a veteran of the 1920s, and here he is down there playing, and brings young Charlie Parker. Bird played with Mary Lou Williams, too, when he was a kid.
Yeah. So he dies in 1955. He's 34 years old. In his time, was he lauded for his contributions to the music? Did people recognize during his lifetime what he had done?
Oh, yeah, sure. You go into Downbeat, and he's number one in the Downbeat polls. Gets lots of coverage. He was a big star.
Yeah.
His string group was very popular. They played concert venues. One thing about Bird is that people often overlook is he loved classical music. Stokowski was in the audience when Bird was playing, I think it was at Birdland, and he quotes the Rites of Spring. And Sikowski slams down on the table, knocks the drinks off the table because he's so blown away.
Wow.
When he was on the road with Woody Herman, he would pour over these Stravinsky charts. And he liked contemporary classical music. But it kind of was a mixed bag for Bird because when he worked with his string group, Norman Granz, when he recorded for Verve Records, Norman Granz paired him with a string group. And the recordings like April in Paris are very lush and very beautiful recordings, and they sold very well. But when he was working with a string group, he could not maintain his normal group. So he had to cut Red Rodney loose. And it kind of cost him his normal group at the expense of the string group. And they were very successful, but artistically, they're not really up to snuff of his original compositions.
You know, it's not lost, I think, on anyone here that this is the 100th anniversary of the birth of Miles Davis. And early in Miles Davis's career, he worked with Bird. And I'm wondering, you know, how did Bird influence Miles Davis for better or for worse? How did that work?
Well, if anybody could influence Miles Davis, it would be Charlie Parker.
Yeah, right.
You know, Miles was from an upper middle class family.
Yeah.
And he was at Juilliard. And Bird and Dizzy were playing down on 52nd Street. And so Miles began working with Bird, but Miles was not up to snuff musically. There's a recording session for the Savoy Records where he fluffs notes. And so Gillespie had to come in, who was playing piano for the session, come in and play trumpet. And Miles hated Bird. He didn't like Bird. I mean, he hated most people anyway, but he really hated Bird. Because Bird, he said Bird made him feel like he was 2 feet tall. I don't think that Miles felt that when he was working with Bird that he measured up. And it's ironic because, you know, Chet Baker was, you know, mentored by Bird, you know, so many other trumpet players, Red Rodney. And he was able to bring him Bob. But Miles was such a complicated individual.
Such a complicated guy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I love Miles Davis, too. And Miles used to play Kansas City. I've got this photo of the Mardi Gras Club. Miles was playing there, 1960. Coltrane played there, too.
Wow, wow. I'm going to move back to something you said a little bit ago, this moment in Kansas City where Bird meets Dizzy Gillespie, obviously a huge moment in the history of this music. Tell us again where that happened and what the circumstances were.
Well, Dizzy Gillespie was in town playing with the Cab Calloway Band at Fairyland Park at 79th and Prospect. And Fairyland Park gave bands employment all summer long. It was a very prestigious gig. And Jay McShann Band was playing out there, but they didn't play that night because Cab Calloway played. And Step Buddy Anderson, God bless Step Buddy, what a wonderful guy he was. It's kind of funny because I know all these guys, you know, it's like they're my friends. I used to hang out with the old guys, now I am the old guy. And but Step Buddy Anderson told me on Bird's birthday about how he dug Dizzy, because Dizzy, you know, had a very distinctive style like Bird. He was not playing bebop, he was playing more like Roy Eldridge. And so he saw him out there when Cab Calloway had fell down. He said, come, you get somebody I want you to meet. And so he made an arrangement for Bird and Gillespie to meet, and they met on the corner of 19th and Vine. It would be the northwest corner.
Wow.
Homer Rodgers Motor was right there, and around the corner, just down the street, was Gates Barbecue. And Bird didn't show up first day, and he showed up second day. They went around to local 627 around the corner, and Bird played for Dizzy, Bird and Buddy played for Dizzy. Buddy had the ideas, but he did not have the technique, and he had suffered from ill health. Buddy was in the Billy Eckstine Band with Bird, but he had to leave because he had tuberculosis. But according to Gillespie in his autobiography, he was playing like Roy Eldridge, and he heard Bird, and it blew him away. Because there's always been this debate about where bebop was born and who the father was.
Right.
But it's on the record. If you listen to the John Tomino recordings of "I'm Getting Sentimental Over You," Bird's playing bebop. Claude Fiddler Williams told me he used to play bebop in Kansas City, only they called it crazy music.
So it wasn't so much Bird and Dizzy. You think it was Bird?
Yeah, it was Bird.
Period. Yeah.
And Bird and Gillespie are long associated in our minds because of the founders of the tradition, but they did not work together that long, really, and they were two different cats. Gillespie was really flamboyant on stage, goofing off and showing off, and playing these really high notes and all that stuff. He was an entertainer, and Bird was very reserved on stage, but Dizzy Gillespie was very conservative in his lifestyle, and Bird was, anything but conservative in his lifestyle. And so they were two different cats, and after they went to played at Billy Berg's in California in '46, they didn't really work together again.
That's interesting.
They went their own ways.
So I'm jumping around here, but later in his career, what happened to Charlie Parker? There was illness, there's addiction, he's really struggling, borrowing money from everybody, drugs. What was he up against toward the final years of his life?
Well, I think Bird struggled with substance abuse and mental illness.
Do we know what flavor of mental illness we're talking about?
I'm not sure. I think part of it was depression. And he struggled with that his whole life. When he was in that wreck in Eldon, Missouri, they gave him heroin instead of morphine because heroin was a kind of a new drug, and they didn't realize it was more addictive than morphine.
Man.
And so he developed a taste, and he'd been smoking reefers, and a lot of the narcotics trade was in the North End at that time. A drummer who I had an opportunity to talk to, and I have information on him too, used to take Bird down to the North End where he'd score his heroin. That's where he would go score. And, in those days, if you were a junkie or drug abuser, and if you were African American, you didn't go to rehab, you went to jail. They just throw your ass in jail and you kick cold turkey. And so he struggled with heroin the rest of his life. And he, it really held him back, I think, creatively as well as professionally.
Well, he was so erratic.
He was known to take huge amounts of heroin, drink prestigious amounts of alcohol. And I think he was just self-medicating, like so many people do. But they didn't treat it then as they do today. But what happened to him later in life is, he was married 4 times. He was married 4 times, and while he was still married to his first wife, Rebecca. And he really found family and really fulfillment with Chan and Kim and Baird and Pre, his children, and Kim. And he enjoyed the family life. And he was kind of a square. He liked doing Sunday dinners and doing corny things and doing magic tricks. We forget that people are just humans, like us.
Yeah, right.
These guys are humans like us. But when he was on the West Coast when Pre died, pardon me, and Pre was his little girl, and she suffered from really serious health issues. And things were never the same between Chan and Bird after Pre died. He took it very hard because he was on the road when she passed. And it was all downhill from then. And that was really what affected him. He's only 34 years old when he died.
It's hard to believe.
The doctor estimated he was in his 50s.
Yeah.
Because he was so. And unfortunately, that part of his legacy kind of overshadows the other things in his life, all the great tunes he came up with, all the friends he made, all the people he helped.
Yeah, I was going to say, because at the end of toward those end of his life, he's erratic, not showing up for gigs, not dependable, driving everybody crazy.
Well, that really became amplified. Pardon me, I've got my allergies are working on me. That was amplified because he was notoriously unreliable in Kansas City. Never showed
Even
up
here,
for a
yeah.
gig on time. When he was with Gillespie in California, he'd show up late, and then he'd start playing his horn outside of the club, come in the door playing Cherokee to kind of compensate for being late, and that kind of got magnified when he was older in his 30s.
You know, a number of years ago for a radio show on Up to Date, you and I took a tour around town of some of Charlie's haunts, of where he was raised. And one place I always remember very clearly, every time I drive by it, I think of our conversation, but because it was right near your old Street Side Records, there was an elementary school there, and that's where Charlie Parker went to elementary school. Tell us about 3 or 4 other places around town that are you associate closely with Charlie.
Well, when
you took me to an apartment building north of there.
Oh yeah, well, there's places all over the city that are associated with Bird. When I did the Kansas City book, I'm not Kansas City book, I'm doing a Bird book. They released the 1930 census, and I was able to locate the residents on 35th and Wyandotte.
Right, that's where we were.
And you know,
it's the second floor
it's a fourplex, yeah, and it's he really grew up in a white middle class neighborhood, and then in 1931 they moved around a corner, but they were nice apartments. He lived in a nice apartment, and he went to school in Westport, and what's the name of the school? Let me think. Hold on a second. I'll remember it in a minute.
Yeah.
But he went to school in Westport, and it was the first school established west of the Mississippi River to educate African Americans. One of the things we've got to think about is when everybody talks about 18th and Vine, but there are other communities. In Westport, there was a Steptoe community, a community of African Americans that worked in that area. And so he, he went to school there, and it was a 3-room schoolhouse, and that's where he first picked up the saxophone in 5th grade. Addie bought him a $40 beat-up saxophone at a pawn shop downtown called Hearst. I used to buy rings at Hearst and my knives, and I used to go to Hearst's all the time. It was a very famous pawn shop. That's where that first came from. Mm-hmm. And yeah.
But there was so much movement in his life.
And then, of course, he at 852 Freeman's, where he lived in Kansas City, Kansas, and they lived above a Ketterson grocery store, and it was just a 1-room apartment. That's where they lived there, and you just. And 18th and Vine, is peppered with places that were associated with him. Lucille's Paradise. He was just all over the place.
They called him Bird because,
well, he was on his way to with Jay McShann to play a gig at Lincoln for Big Red for Nebraska, and on the way up there, the car he was riding in ran over a chicken. And in those days, farmers would live pretty close to the roads, and these chickens would be out in the yard. And so he begged the driver to go back and get the yard bird, because he wanted he was staying at a boarding house. He wanted the woman to cook him yard bird for him. And so everybody started calling him yard bird, and then finally that was shortened to bird, which is something kind of transcendental, But while he was at the grade school in Westport, the music teacher, the Bird and these other little kids were playing outside, and the music teacher said, "You little yard birds, get on in here," referring to chickens. And that's where he first picked it up. And of course, chicken's one of his favorite foods.
You know, if you
It was Penn School in Westport.
if you talk to a jazz player in Denmark Saturday night, he would know Charlie Parker.
Oh, yeah. Charlie Parker is extremely well known. Well, he's a legend, and everybody knows Charlie Parker.
Yeah.
That documentary I worked on with KCPT called "Bird Not Out of Nowhere." In the end credits, they have people all over the world talking about how Charlie Parker influenced them, and it's a wonderful coda for the documentary.
Yeah. Talk to us about the relationship between Jay McShann and Charlie. Jay being another local player, phenomenal. What was that relationship like? How did it change over the years?
Well, Jay McShann, I had the privilege to spend a lot of time with Jay McShann. I was one of the people that Mary Ann trusted with Jay McShann. And we used to hang out and talk, and I sold his records, and we became good friends. And he fondly remembered Bird, and they had a very interesting relationship. I don't think Bird would have ever gotten out of town if it hadn't been for Jay McShann. And Jay McShann would put up with Bird where other band leaders would not put up with him. And according to him, he'd tell Bird, he'd go, okay. When Bird would goof, he'd go crazy, go nuts, and then come back when you're done. And that's what he would say. And they were also collaborators. They wrote Jumpin' the Blues. Jay was the one that brought Bird into the limelight nationally with the recording of Hootie Blues, which is Bird's first commercial recording, where his first commercial solo, his first solo on a commercial recording. And Jay loved Bird, but once they broke out nationally, Bird became a liability in the band because of his habits and just his lifestyle. He got into a fight with Walter Barnes on the bandstand.
Right, during a live performance.
During a performance at the Savoy Ballroom. And then he came out to solo, and they were playing the Paradise Ballroom in Detroit, and he OD'd on stage and had to drag him off. And Earl Father Hines told Jay, said, I'm going to get him. Hines wanted to hire Bird, but he was still in Jay's band. So Jay actually let Hines hire him away because he was just too much trouble for him. And then about 2 weeks later, Hines saw, a month or so later, McShann saw Hines, and Hines begged him to take Bird back. He said, he's the worst person I've ever known. He owes everybody money. He doesn't know where his horn is. And so, sometimes you got to watch what you get for. But they're always associated, and Jay loved Bird, and Bird loved Jay. I
just was going to say, did the relationship endure the tardiness and all the bad habits?
Oh yeah, and they played around town together for a long time. Martin's on the Plaza, Clara Martin's Club, at the Century Room, and I just don't think that Bird would have. Because he was a mess in Kansas City. I'm not sure he would have ever made it out of Kansas City had it been for Jay.
I'm going to give you guys a chance to ask some questions just after this next one. How did Jay McShann and Bird meet? Just Jay heard him coming up, or?
Well, in summer of 1936, Jay McShann was on his way to visit his uncle Odie in Omaha. And he was riding the bus, and they stopped at the bus station, and not Effigy Ware, another musician from Muskogee had told Bird to come by the Reno Club and to see the band. And Jay decided, he wanted to stay. And so he stayed here, and he's working on a club on Independence Avenue. And one day he's walking down 12th Street, and it's outside of the Barley Duke Club, and he hears this saxophonist coming out over the sound system, and it's Bird. And so he introduces himself to Bird, and says, I've never heard anybody quite like you. Are you new here? And Bird said, no, I've been here for a while. And that's where they first hooked up. And he said, well, I hope we get to work together. And he said, well, they will. We will later on.
How about your questions for Chuck about Charlie Parker? Yeah. Anybody? Yeah.
Talk about Charlie Parker. Mary Lou Williams, singer and piano player.
No, Mary Lou didn't sing. She just played piano. Yeah, yeah. But you know, he played with Mary Lou when she said he was in short pants. You know, she was another one that passed the tradition on, and she was one of the heroes of Kansas City.
Heroes of Kansas City. Yeah, absolutely. There's just the new news out, I think today, there's going to be a women's jazz festival. I'm not sure when, but they're going to have a thing to announce, a women's jazz festival in Kansas City, probably next year, to commemorate the big festivals they had when we talked last time in 78 to 81 or something like that. So
Yeah,
that's
77.
And Mary Lou Williams so integral and is part of that. Yeah.
I saw her when it went play there when she played there.
Really?
Yeah, and George Salisbury was a friend of mine. I was George's driver. George did not drive. George Salisbury, great pianist. And I was working in the record business. I was managing Penny Lane Records, and I got wind that Mary Lou Williams was playing a parlor concert at Rockhurst. And so I said, George, you want to go over? And George goes, oh, yeah. And so we went over, and there's Mary Lou Williams sitting there at the piano, and she sees George coming, and she gives him a big hug. He had been one of her students in the 1930s. And Mary Lou, I shook hands with Mary Lou, and man, when you shook hands with Mary Lou, you knew you shook hands with somebody because she had incredible grip. But the Women's Jazz Festival was a very important festival. I remember when they started up, and Diane and Carol, and it was really a bold statement about women and women's roles in jazz.
Yeah.
And one of the things that always set Kansas City apart from the other cradles of jazz is the number of women who participated as instrumentalists. Two of the great bands, Georgie Lee and Andy Kirk, had women pianists. Melba Liston got her start here. Countess Margaret Johnson, one of the great tragic figure in Kansas City, who died way too young. Brilliant pianist, you know, and just it's just incredible. And I remember the buzz about the Women's Jazz Festival, and it started out at you've all heard that from last week.
Yeah. Well, anyway, it's going to be a deal, I think, probably next year here in town.
Yeah,
So
but there's going to be an event at Ted's Tap Room, and I hesitate to give the exact date, but it's going to be in September. You can find out.
where they're going to announce plans.
Yeah, I was talking to
saw that
Christina Ning today
yeah.
earlier on about it.
Yeah.
And there's quite a buzz, and they got the board up, and they're really gonna make a big deal out of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So just a few more things. So Charlie, invents bebop. How was that received at the time? How did other jazz musicians react to what he had come up with?
Well, there's there's a generational divide. The old traditional trad jazz guys didn't like it.
Yeah.
But the young people loved it, and the critics, a lot of the critics didn't like it. They made fun of it, but there were critics that were champions of it. Leonard Feather was a champion of bebop, in downbeat, and you can see it all play out in downbeat and metronome.
How did Charlie react to the negative comments about what he had come up with?
Well, he was a very forgiving individual. It didn't really bother him that much. I mean,
He just did his thing.
Yeah, he just did his thing. I don't think he followed it that closely, but he did receive his award. His awards. He #1 downbeat, and it's kind of funny because there's very little footage of him on film, and there's that one film where he and Gillespie had just won their downbeat awards, and the guy who's the host of it is like, Charlie Parker, and you can see Bird looking at him, going, kind of shining him on a little bit.
At the end of the day, he's a man full of tremendous contradictions. He's a great musician. He doesn't show up on time. He's generous. He's miserly. Doesn't pay people back. I mean, this is a lot of human being wrapped up in one individual, right?
Yeah, like, he could be an interesting couple of guys. That's what how my wife refers to me. He was a contradiction. And of course, he had a way of empathizing with individuals that he met. And so everybody comes away with a different impression of what he was like. In Robert Reisner's book, it's like there's 82 different Charlie Parkers. And what he was like depends upon who you're talking to. And so, it's and there's one of the challenges about writing about Bird is there's so much myth surrounding him.
Yes.
And, when I was hanging out at Milton Morris's place, Milton had some great Bird stories. It had wonderful Bird stories. And Milton used to hired him to play at the Hey Club. That was at 4th and Cherry. And, it's writing about him is I had to strip away the myths. And a lot of those have been wrapped around him by Ross Russell, who wrote the previous biography of Charlie Parker. And Ross set out to write a scholarly book about Bird. And if you look at the early chapters that were published in the French Jazz Journal, and you look at his writings at his collection down in Texas, initially that's what he started out to do, tell Bird's story. And then Albert Goldman convinced him to sensationalize Bird's life. And so he included fictive elements in his biography. And so I had to kind of just shove that all aside. That was not available to me. And when I did the Kansas City book, I went through the Kansas City Call, the microfilm of the Kansas City Call, and made copies of all the music references from 1919 to 1943.
Were there a lot?
Oh, yeah. About this many. I mean, and broke it down by year and then created an index. I'm a little obsessive compulsive. That helps when you're a writer. So I was able to kind of straighten out his career here locally, and then, just tell his story locally and to strip away some of those myths. His first wife, Rebecca, and his relationship with her, his relationship with his wives, it's just incredible,
What did you learn in the course of that research that maybe surprised you the most about Bird?
I think how young he started.
Yeah.
I mean, there's references to him, in the early 1930s, and just what a kind of a revered figure he became later in his life, too. The Kansas City Call is now available online through the Kansas City Public Library and also the Mid-Continent Public Library. So you can go in and look up all these references to Charlie Parker. Unfortunately, when they digitized it, they often digitized the national edition, which didn't include any of the information about the local scene. So you still got to go back to the microfilm if you really want to dig deep.
Yeah. How did he die?
He died of, he was on his way to play a gig and he became unwell. And he stopped at...
in New York?
In New York City, to Countess Nika's apartment across the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He didn't feel well, and so she took care of him in his final days. And he had ulcers. He was just multiple ailments that did him in. And she took care of him, and he was watching the Tommy Dorsey show, and he was laughing and passed right there. He didn't have any place else to go, and so she put up with Monk.
She put up with Monk.
Yeah. One of the things about bebop is Monk, Bud Powell, Charlie Parker, all these pioneers had issues with mental health. That's just the way they were,
Maybe a silly question, but if you had a chance, if you walked in the door tonight, what's the first thing you'd want to ask him? Something you wondered about that you would have liked to have found out directly from him? That's such a public radio question, but that's what it is. Yeah.
Well, we're a couple of public radio kind of guys.
You'd think. Yeah.
I think I'd want to know about his personal life more, about what he really enjoyed, you know, in his day-to-day life, what he liked to do. I mean, he was kind of a square, you know. He liked westerns. You know, he'd go see the westerns with Rebecca, his first wife, at the Gem Theater. You know, Gabby Hayes was walking down the street in New York City, and Bird walks up to him and says, "You're Gabby Hayes," and Gabby goes, "Yeah, and you're Charlie Parker."
No kidding.
Yeah.
No kidding.
There's all these great stories about Bird. You could do a whole book on just bird stories, bird lore.
Bird stories, yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, Chuck Haddix.
Thank you.
You're the man, Chuck.
It's been a real pleasure sitting in here and sharing these stories with you. Thank you so much for coming by tonight. And thank you. Wait a minute, I'm going to say thank you, Steve Kraske.
Well, thanks, Chuck.
I mean, he is the moderator with the mostest, man. He's the greatest, you know.
Yeah. Well, thank you all. Yeah. That was great, Chuck. Thanks. Yeah.